At my son's funeral, while I stood devastated beside his casket, my phone buzzed with a text from his number. "Mom, I'm alive. Don't trust Natalie. She tried to kill me." What my daughter-in-law didn't know was that I wasn't just a grieving mother. I was Detective Commander Rachel Winters, and I'd been investigating her family's criminal empire for 3 years. Hold up. I'm curious where you're listening from, and if this story spoke to you, make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, what I have planned for tomorrow is going to blow you away. The morning of what I believed was my son's funeral began like the worst day of any mother's life. Rain pelted the windows of my Riverside home as I stood in my black dress, staring at the photo of my 28-year-old son, David. His bright smile looked back at me from the silver frame, the same smile that had lit up every room he entered since he was a child. David had been my only child, born when I was 22 and fresh out of the police academy. His father had left when David was 3, unable to handle the demands of being married to a cop. For 25 years, it had been just the two of us against the world. I'd watched him grow from a curious toddler who asked endless questions to a brilliant software engineer who could solve any technical problem thrown his way. 3 days earlier, I'd received the call every parent dreads. David had been found dead in his car at the bottom of Clearwater Canyon, apparently having lost control on the winding mountain road during a late-night drive. The local sheriff's department ruled it an accident, a tragic case of a young man driving too fast on dangerous curbs. But something had felt wrong from the moment I saw his body. David was the most cautious driver I knew, someone who wouldn't even change lanes without checking his mirrors twice. He'd never driven those canyon roads at night, always saying they made him nervous. Yet here I was, preparing to bury my only child because of what everyone insisted was a simple accident. Standing in St. Catherine's Cathedral that gray October morning, I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped away everything that made me who I was. The pews were filled with David's colleagues from TechFlow Solutions, neighbors from his apartment complex, and friends from college. At the front, his widow Natalie sat dabbing her eyes with a tissue, the picture of a devastated young bride. Natalie had married David just 8 months ago in what seemed like a whirlwind romance. They'd met at a technology conference in Portland, where she'd approached him at the networking reception. She was 25, stunning in that effortless way some women managed, with platinum blonde hair and the kind of confidence that drew people to her like moths to flame. I'd had reservations about their quick engagement, but David was so clearly smitten that I'd kept my concerns to myself. "She makes me feel alive, Mom," he told me over dinner one evening, his eyes bright with happiness. "I never thought I'd find someone who gets my work and actually finds it interesting." Natalie had seemed pleasant enough during our few interactions, though I'd noticed that she was always vague about her background. She'd mentioned growing up back east and having family in various businesses, but never provided specifics. When I tried to learn more about her relatives for wedding planning purposes, she smiled and said her family preferred to keep their distance from celebrations. What struck me as odd was how quickly she'd encouraged David to take out a substantial life insurance policy after their marriage. "We need to protect each other," she'd explained when David mentioned it to me. The policy was for $2 million, an enormous sum for a young software engineer, but David was making excellent money and wanted to provide security for his new wife. As the funeral service began, Reverend Hamilton's voice echoed through the cathedral, speaking about David's kindness, his brilliant mind, and the bright future that had been tragically cut short. I tried to focus on the words, but my detective instincts kept nagging at me. 3 things bothered me about David's death that I couldn't shake. First, the timing. David had supposedly been driving to meet a client for an emergency software consultation at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night, but I'd never known him to take client meetings that late, and TechFlow's policies specifically discouraged after-hours emergency calls unless they involved critical system failures at hospitals or emergency services. Second, the location. Clearwater Canyon was 20 miles out of the way from David's apartment to anywhere he might have had legitimate business. The winding mountain road was used mainly by locals as a scenic route during daylight hours, not as a practical thoroughfare for business meetings. Third, the condition of his car. While the sheriff report noted significant damage consistent with the crash, I'd caught a glimpse of the vehicle at the impound lot. The damage pattern seemed wrong for a simple loss of control accident. The rear bumper showed impact marks that suggested another vehicle had made contact, but this detail had been dismissed as damage that occurred during the recovery process. But today wasn't about my suspicions. Today was about saying goodbye to my son, regardless of the questions swirling in my mind. I forced myself to listen as friends and colleagues shared memories of David's humor, his generosity, and his excitement about his new marriage.
David talked about Natalie constantly, said his best friend Jeremy during the eulogy. He'd light up whenever he mentioned their plans for the future. They were talking about buying a house, maybe starting a family. He was the happiest I'd ever seen him. As Jeremy spoke, I glanced at Natalie in the front pew. She sat perfectly still, her posture straight and composed despite the tears on her cheeks. Something about her grief struck me as almost performed, like an actress playing a role she'd rehearsed, but I immediately felt guilty for the thought. People grieved differently, and I was hardly in a position to judge anyone's emotional responses given my own numbness. The service continued with hymns David had loved and readings from scriptures that had comforted him during difficult times. As the final prayer was offered, I felt the weight of finality settling over me. This was it. This was goodbye to the person who had been the center of my world for 28 years. That's when my phone vibrated in my purse. At first, I ignored it. Nothing could be important enough to interrupt my son's funeral. But the vibration came again, insistent and urgent. Something made me glance at the screen and my blood turned to ice. The message was from David's phone number. "Mom, I'm alive. Don't trust Natalie. She tried to kill me. I'm hiding. Meet me at our spot. You know where. Come alone. Delete this message." My hands began shaking so violently I nearly dropped the phone. I read the message 3 more times, each reading making my heart pound harder. Our spot? David was referring to Henderson's Diner on Oak Street, where we'd shared breakfast every Sunday morning throughout his childhood and still met whenever he needed to talk about something important. But this was impossible. David was dead. I'd identified his body myself at the morgue 3 days ago. I'd seen his face, pale and still, with the injuries from the crash visible, but not severe enough to obscure his features. The medical examiner had confirmed the identification through dental records and a distinctive scar on his left hand from a childhood accident. Yet here was a message from his phone using language only David would know. The reference to our spot wasn't something that appeared on his social media or in any public records. It was our private tradition, something only the two of us shared. My mind raced through possibilities. Someone could have found his phone at the crash site and was playing a cruel joke. But the phone had supposedly been destroyed in the accident, along with his wallet and other personal items. The sheriff's department had told me nothing was recoverable from the wreckage. Could someone be impersonating David? But who would know about Henderson's Diner? And why would they tell me not to trust Natalie? Unless David really was alive. The thought was so impossible, so desperately hopeful, that I almost dismissed it immediately. But as I sat in that cathedral, surrounded by mourners grieving my son, another thought crept into my mind. What if my detective instincts had been right all along? What if David's death wasn't an accident? And what if somehow, impossibly, David had survived? I looked up at Natalie, who was accepting condolences from the pastor. For just a moment, when she thought no one was watching, her expression changed. The grief disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like satisfaction. That's when I knew I had to find out the truth, no matter how impossible it seemed. Because if there was even the smallest chance my son was alive, I would move heaven and earth to bring him home safely. And if someone had tried to kill him, I would make sure they faced justice. After all, they had no idea that the grieving mother sitting in the back pew was actually one of the most experienced homicide detectives in the state, with resources and skills they couldn't begin to imagine. The funeral was ending, but my investigation was just beginning. We poured our hearts into researching and telling this story. If you're hooked, show some love with a subscribe. Now, where were we? I slipped out of the cathedral during the final hymn, and my heart hammering against my ribs as I processed the impossible message from David's phone. Henderson's Diner was 15-minute drive from St. Catherine's, and I needed to get there without arousing suspicion. The last thing I could afford was Natalie or anyone else following me if this was real. As mourners filed out for the burial service, I approached Natalie with what I hoped looked like maternal concern. "Sweetheart, I'm feeling overwhelmed," I told her, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "I think I need to go home and rest instead of going to the cemetery. Will you be all right?" Her eyes flickered with something that might have been relief. "Of course, Rachel, I completely understand. This has been so difficult for all of us." She embraced me with what felt like genuine warmth, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was pleased I wouldn't be at the burial. "The reception afterward is at the Riverside Country Club. Please come if you feel up to it. David would have wanted people to celebrate his life."
I nodded and made my way to my car, a plain gray sedan that served me well in my detective work, precisely because it was so unremarkable. As I drove through downtown Riverside toward Henderson's Diner, my mind raced through every possible explanation for what was happening. The most logical explanation was that someone had found David's phone and was playing a sick prank. But the phone had supposedly been destroyed in the crash, and besides, who would know about our Sunday breakfast tradition? David had never posted about it on social media, and we'd never mentioned it to anyone else. It was our private ritual, something that belonged just to us. The second possibility was that I was having some kind of psychological break brought on by grief. Losing a child was one of the most traumatic experiences a person could endure, and I'd seen cases where extreme stress caused people to experience hallucinations or false hopes. Maybe I was so desperate to believe David was alive that my mind was creating evidence to support that impossible wish. But there was a third possibility, one that my detective training wouldn't let me dismiss, despite how incredible it seemed. What if David really was alive? What if the body I'd identified wasn't actually my son? What if someone had staged his death so convincingly that even I, with 15 years of homicide investigation experience, had been fooled? Henderson's Diner sat on a quiet corner of Oak Street, the same red vinyl booths and checkered floor that had been there since David was 5 years old. Marge Henderson, now in her 70s, still worked the morning shift and remembered every regular customer's order. David and I had claimed the corner booth by the window as our permanent spot, where we'd shared countless conversations about school, work, relationships, and life. I parked across the street and studied the diner carefully before entering. My training had taught me to assess every situation for potential threats, and if David was really alive and hiding, it meant someone dangerous was looking for him. The parking lot held only 3 cars, none of which I recognized. Through the windows, I could see the usual lunch crowd, construction workers, retirees, and office employees grabbing quick meals. Taking a deep breath, I crossed the street and pushed through the familiar glass door, the bell chiming the same welcome it had for 23 years. Marge looked up from behind the counter, her face immediately creasing with sympathy. "Oh, honey," she said, coming around to embrace me. "I heard about David on the news. I'm so terribly sorry. That boy was sunshine itself, always brightening up this place with his smile." "Thank you, Marge," I managed, my voice thick with emotion. The kindness in her weathered face nearly broke my composure. "I was wondering, has anyone been asking about David recently, or about our usual table?" Her expression grew puzzled. "Asking about David? Well, there was that pretty blonde girl who came in yesterday, said she was his wife. She wanted to know if he'd been here recently, seemed real concerned about his whereabouts the week before the accident." My pulse quickened. Natalie had been here asking questions? What did you tell her? "Just that I hadn't seen him for a couple weeks, which was unusual since you two came in most Sundays." She seemed relieved to hear that, which struck me as odd. I'd have thought his wife would be upset that he'd missed your tradition. This was the first confirmation that something was seriously wrong. Natalie had lied to me. She'd never mentioned coming to the diner, and she certainly never expressed concern about David missing our breakfasts. If anything, she'd seemed to discourage our Sunday meetings, suggesting David needed to focus more on their marriage and less on childhood routines. "Marge, this might sound strange, but if anyone comes asking about me being here today, could you tell them you haven't seen me?" Her eyes sharpened with understanding. Marge had lived through enough small-town drama to recognize when someone was in trouble. "Of course, honey. You just be careful, whatever this is about."
I made my way to our corner booth, sliding into the seat where David always sat so I could watch both the entrance and the back exit. The table felt enormous without his presence, the red vinyl cold beneath my hands. I ordered coffee I didn't want and waited, checking my phone every second for another message. 20 minutes passed, then 30. I began to think this was either a cruel joke or a grief-induced delusion when my phone buzzed again. "Look under the table, taped underneath. Be careful, they might be watching." My hands trembling, I carefully felt along the underside of the table. My fingers found what felt like a small package wrapped in plastic and secured with tape. I worked it loose as discreetly as possible, palming it while I pretended to reach for my purse. The package contained a flash drive and a handwritten note in David's distinctive scrawl, "Mom, if you're reading this, something went wrong. The body they found isn't me. I had to disappear because I discovered something that put my life in danger. Natasha is not who she claims to be. Her real name is Natasha Volkov, and she's connected to the Kozlov crime family you've been investigating. She married me to get close to your cases through me. The flash drive has proof. Meet me tonight at midnight at the old warehouse on Industrial Drive, the one where we used to go when I was learning to drive. Trust no one else. Love, David."
My coffee cup clattered against the saucer as my hands began shaking uncontrollably. The Kozlov crime family? I'd been building a case against them for 3 years. They were suspected of running a sophisticated money laundering operation through legitimate businesses. But every time we got close to building a solid case, witnesses disappeared or evidence went missing. Someone inside law enforcement had been feeding them information, but we'd never been able to identify the leak. If David was telling the truth, Natalie had married him specifically to access information about my investigation. She would have had access to my home computer, could have overheard phone conversations, might even have seen case files if David had ever visited my home office. The thought that I'd unwittingly welcomed a criminal into my family made me sick to my stomach. But more importantly, if this note was real, David was alive. Somewhere out there, my son was hiding, afraid for his life, depending on me to help him. The relief was so overwhelming I had to grip the table to keep from collapsing. I read the note 3 more times, analyzing the handwriting with the scrutiny I'd apply to evidence in a case. The letter formation, the way he dotted his I's, the characteristic slant, everything looked authentic. But handwriting could be forged, and anyone who'd seen David's writing could potentially replicate it well enough to fool someone desperate to believe. The flash drive was another matter. If it really contained evidence against Natalie and the Kozlov family, that would be nearly impossible to fake convincingly. But I couldn't examine it here, not safely. I needed to get somewhere secure where I could analyze the contents without risking exposure. As I prepared to leave the diner, my phone rang. Natalie's name appeared on the screen. "Rachel, I wanted to check on you. You seemed so upset when you left the cathedral." "I'm managing," I replied carefully. "Just needed some time alone." "Of course, I completely understand. Listen, I was thinking about David's things. His computer and files from work. I should probably go through them and decide what to keep. Would you like to be there when I do that? I know some of it might have sentimental value." The request sent alarm bells ringing in my mind. If Natalie was really Natasha Volkov, she would want to eliminate any evidence that might expose her true identity or her family's operations. David's computer could contain communications or files that would prove her connection to the Kozlovs. "That's very thoughtful," I said. "When were you planning to do that?" "This evening, after the reception. I thought I'd start fresh tomorrow. Begin the healing process. Begin the cover-up process, more likely. If David was alive and had gathered evidence against her, she would need to eliminate anything that could corroborate his claims. This evening might be my only chance to preserve whatever evidence existed in their apartment." I told her, "I'd like that. It would help me feel closer to him." "Wonderful. Come by around 7. We can order dinner and go through everything together." After ending the call, I sat in my car outside Henderson's diner, weighing my options. I had 2 critical decisions to make. First, should I trust that the message and note were really from David, or was I being manipulated by someone who wanted me to believe my son was alive?
And second, if I did believe David was alive, how could I help him without alerting Natalie to what I knew? My detective training had taught me to trust evidence over emotion, but the evidence was conflicting. The body I'd identified had David's dental records, his distinctive scar, even a birthmark on his shoulder I'd seen countless times. How could that be explained if he was really alive? But the note referenced details only David would know. The old warehouse where I'd taught him to drive when he was 16, his knowledge of my Kozlov investigation, even the way he always called me mom in writing rather than mother like he did in speech. I made my decision. Whether or not David was really alive, someone was trying to tell me that Natalie was dangerous and connected to the criminal family I'd been investigating. That information alone was worth pursuing, regardless of its source. I drove home to my ranch house on Maple Street, the same house where David had grown up, where his bedroom still contained his high school soccer trophies and college textbooks. But now I wasn't seeing it as a grieving mother's shrine to her lost child. I was seeing it as a crime scene that might contain evidence of infiltration by the Kozlov organization. In my home office, I booted up my secure laptop and inserted the flash drive, running it through every security protocol I knew before accessing its contents. What I found made my blood run cold. The drive contained dozens of documents, photographs, and audio recordings that painted a picture of systematic deception stretching back over a year. There were photos of Natalie meeting with known Kozlov associates, bank records showing payments from shell companies connected to the family, and most damning of all, transcripts of conversations where she discussed gathering intelligence on my investigation. One audio file was particularly chilling. In it, I could hear Natalie's voice clearly. The mother is getting close to identifying our operations through the construction companies. David mentioned she's been working late, reviewing financial records. We need to accelerate our timeline before she connects the dots. Another voice, heavily accented, responded, "Then we eliminate the threat. Both of them, if necessary."
"Not yet," Natalie replied. "David still has access to her files. Let me get what we need first. Then we can stage it to look like a murder-suicide. Grieving cop kills son, then herself. Very tragic, very believable." The recording was dated 2 weeks ago. My hands were shaking as I saved copies of everything to multiple secure locations. If this evidence was authentic, Natalie hadn't just infiltrated my family, she'd been planning to kill both David and me to protect the Kozlov organization's operations. And if David had discovered this plan, that's when I understood. David must have found this evidence and realized his life was in danger. Rather than coming to me directly and risking both our lives, he'd staged his own death to buy time while he gathered proof of the conspiracy. The body I'd identified, somehow they'd managed to create a convincing substitute, perhaps using dental implants and surgical modification on an unidentified victim. The plan was brilliant in its desperation. By dying, David had removed himself as an immediate threat while giving me the evidence I needed to take down the organization. But it also meant he was alone, hiding, completely dependent on me to expose the truth before Natalie realized her plan had failed. I looked at the clock. It was 3:30 p.m. I had less than 4 hours before I was supposed to meet Natalie at David's apartment and less than 9 hours before the midnight meeting at the warehouse if David was really alive and waiting for me there. But first, I needed to verify this evidence and figure out how they'd managed to fool the medical examiner's office with a fake body. And I needed to do it all without alerting anyone in the department that might be feeding information to the Kozlovs. My son was alive, but both our lives depended on how carefully I played the next few hours. One mistake, and Natalie would realize her cover was blown. And if that happened, I might lose David forever. This time, for real. I had 3 hours to prepare for what could be the most dangerous evening of my career. If the evidence on David's flash drive was authentic, I was walking into a trap set by a trained operative who had already planned my murder. But I was no longer just a grieving mother. I was Detective Commander Rachel Winters, and I had resources Natasha Volkov couldn't imagine. My first call was to Detective Lieutenant James Morrison, my most trusted colleague and the only person in the department I was certain wasn't compromised. Jim had worked with me for 8 years, and his integrity was beyond question. More importantly, he'd been helping me investigate the Kozlov organization from the beginning. Jim, I need you to listen carefully and ask no questions until I'm finished. I'm about to tell you something that will sound impossible. I explained everything: the text message, the evidence on the flash drive, the revelation about Natalie's true identity, and my suspicion that David was still alive. Jim listened in complete silence until I finished. Jesus, Rachel, if even half of this is true, you're in serious danger. We need to bring in the full task force immediately. No, I said firmly. We know there's a leak in the department. If word gets back to the Kozlovs that we've discovered Natasha's identity, David dies, assuming he's really alive. And if he's not, I lose my only chance to expose their operation. Then what's your plan? I'm going to that apartment tonight as scheduled, but I need backup positioned strategically, and I need you to run independent verification on this evidence while I'm there. Can you access the medical examiner's files on David's body without alerting anyone? Dr. Patricia Henley performed the autopsy. She's solid, been there 15 years, no connections to any of our suspects. I can reach out to her directly. Good. Also, I need you to pull surveillance footage from every camera within a 5-mile radius of Clearwater Canyon for the night David supposedly died. Look for vehicles that don't match the official report. Rachel, this is a massive undertaking. If you're wrong about this, if I'm wrong, I'll face the consequences. But if I'm right and we don't act, more people will die. The Kozlovs have been operating with impunity for 3 years because they've had inside information. This might be our only shot at taking them down. Jim agreed to coordinate the surveillance and evidence analysis. We established communication protocols. He would monitor my location through my phone's GPS, and I would check in every 30 minutes using coded messages. If I missed a check-in, he would move in with backup. Next, I called Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic pathologist I'd worked with on several cases. Sarah owed me a favor, and more importantly, she had access to advanced facial reconstruction software that could help verify if the body I'd identified was really David. This is highly irregular, Rachel, but given what you've told me about the corruption investigation, I understand the urgency. Send me everything you have. I can have preliminary results within 2 hours.
With my backup team in place, I turned my attention to the evening ahead. If I was walking into a confrontation with a trained operative, I needed every advantage I could get. I changed into tactical clothing that looked casual but would provide protection and freedom of movement. I checked my service weapon and backup piece, ensuring both were loaded and easily accessible. But weapons wouldn't be enough if Natasha suspected I knew her true identity. I needed to maintain the facade of a grieving mother while gathering additional evidence that could be used in court. That meant wearing a wire. I contacted Agent Lisa Park, my FBI liaison on the Kozlov task force. Lisa had been pushing for more aggressive action against the organization, and she jumped at the chance to gather evidence against a key operative. "We can have you wired with our latest surveillance equipment," Lisa said when I explained the situation. "Voice-activated, encrypted transmission, completely undetectable. But Rachel, if she discovers you're recording her, your life is in immediate danger. I understand the risks, but this might be our only shot at getting her to incriminate herself." An hour later, Lisa and her technical team met me at a safe house across town. They fitted me with a sophisticated recording device that looked like a fitness tracker, complete with fake heart rate monitoring in case Natasha examined it closely. The device would record everything and transmit it simultaneously to FBI servers. "Remember," Lisa briefed me, "your goal is to get her talking about the Kozlov family, her marriage to David, and especially any references to eliminating threats. Don't push too hard. Let her volunteer information.
People like her are trained to detect interrogation techniques. As 6:30 p.m. approached, I received updates from my team. Jim had spoken with Dr. Henley, who agreed to re-examine her autopsy findings discreetly. Sarah's preliminary facial reconstruction analysis showed significant inconsistencies between David's known physical characteristics and the body I'd identified, but she needed more time for a definitive conclusion. Most intriguingly, Jim had found surveillance footage from a gas station 15 miles from Clearwater Canyon showing a black SUV following David's car on the night he supposedly died. The SUV's license plate was registered to a shell company with connections to the Kozlov organization. "Rachel, this is looking more and more like your son was right," Jim reported. "Someone definitely staged his death. The question is whether he escaped or they moved his body after faking the crash scene." Armed with this information, I drove to David's apartment complex on Birchwood Avenue. The building was a modern 3-story structure where David and Natasha had lived on the second floor since their marriage. I'd visited several times, but tonight I was seeing it through different eyes, looking for security cameras, escape routes, and potential surveillance positions. Natasha answered the door wearing simple black pants and a sweater, her makeup minimal, and her expression appropriately somber. To any observer, she looked like a young widow barely holding herself together. But now I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the way she assessed my mood and body language before speaking. "Rachel, thank you for coming. I know this is difficult, but I thought it would help both of us to feel close to David tonight." The apartment looked exactly as I remembered it. David's computer set up in the corner, his books still on the shelves, his coffee mug unwashed in the sink. But I noticed new details. A small camera positioned to monitor the computer area, additional locks on the windows, and what looked like a sophisticated alarm system David had never mentioned installing. "I've ordered Chinese food," Natasha said, leading me to the living room. "David's favorite from Golden Dragon. I thought it would be nice to honor his memory." She was good, I had to admit. The detail about David's favorite restaurant was accurate, and her emotional delivery seemed genuine. If I hadn't seen the evidence on the flash drive, I might have been completely convinced by her performance. "That's very thoughtful," I replied, settling onto the couch. He did love their Kung Pao chicken. "He talked about you constantly," she continued, her voice catching slightly. "How proud he was of your career, how much your Sunday breakfasts meant to him. I know I sometimes felt jealous about how close you two were." This was new information. Natasha had never expressed jealousy about my relationship with David before. In fact, she'd encouraged our closeness, even suggesting we spend more time together. Unless... "Jealous?" I prompted gently. "Not in a bad way. It's just that David looked up to you so much. Your work, your strength, your dedication to justice. He wanted to be worthy of being your son." She was fishing for information about my current cases, trying to determine how much I knew about the Kozlov investigation. I decided to give her something to work with. "David always supported my work, even when it was dangerous. I'm working on a particularly challenging case right now, organized crime with connections to Eastern European syndicates. David worried about my safety." Natasha's pupils dilated slightly, a stress response that confirmed she recognized the reference. "What kind of organized crime?" she asked, her tone carefully casual. "Money laundering primarily, but we suspect they're involved in more serious crimes. Murder, intimidation, corruption of public officials. It's been a 3-year investigation with very few solid leads." "That sounds terrifying. Do you think they know you're investigating them?" The question was perfectly phrased to sound like innocent concern, but I caught the underlying urgency. She needed to know how close I was to identifying the organization's members and operation.
"Possibly," I said. "We've had some setbacks that suggest someone might be feeding them information. Witnesses disappearing, evidence going missing. It's frustrating." "David mentioned you'd been working late a lot recently. I hope you're being careful." There it was. Confirmation that she'd been monitoring my activities through David. The recording device captured every word as she inadvertently admitted to surveillance. The food arrived.
providing a natural break in our conversation. As we ate, Natasha steered the discussion toward David's computer and work files, suggesting we start there, since the technical stuff might be too complex for her to understand alone. David was always so secretive about his work, she said, leading me to his computer setup. Client confidentiality, he said. I barely know what any of these files contain. She was lying. David had been a software engineer, not a lawyer. Client confidentiality wasn't typically a major concern in his field. But if she'd been using his computer to access my files or communicate with the Kozlov organization, she would want to ensure any incriminating evidence was eliminated. Let me see if I can make sense of his project files, I offered, sitting down at his desk. Maybe there are some personal documents mixed in with the work stuff. As I navigated through David's computer, I was careful to check for signs that files had been recently deleted or modified. What I found was revealing. Large portions of his browser history had been wiped clean, several folders showed recent deletion activity, and his email had been completely purged. But whoever had cleaned the computer had made one crucial mistake. They'd missed David's automatic backup system, which stored encrypted copies of all his files on a hidden partition. As I accessed the backup files, I found exactly what I was looking for. Evidence that David had discovered Natasha's true identity weeks before his supposed death. Hidden in his personal files were screenshots of bank transfers from Kozlov shell companies, copies of emails between Natasha and unknown contacts discussing the mother's investigation, and most damning of all, audio recordings David had made of Natasha's phone conversations with her handlers. "Find anything interesting?" Natasha asked, moving closer to look over my shoulder. "Just some old photos and college papers," I lied, quickly closing the backup files. "Nothing too personal." But I could feel the tension in the room shifting. Natasha had noticed my interest in the computer went beyond casual browsing, and her demeanor was becoming more guarded. I needed to wrap up this visit soon before she became suspicious enough to take action. "This is harder than I expected," I said, standing up from the computer. "Maybe we should continue this another time." "Of course," she agreed quickly. "I think we've done enough for tonight." As she walked me to the door, I noticed her hand hovering near her purse, the same position trained operatives used when reaching for a concealed weapon. The evening had provided crucial evidence, but it had also confirmed that I was walking a razor edge between discovery and disaster. "Thank you for dinner," I said, as naturally as possible, "and for sharing David's memory with me tonight. We should do this again soon. Maybe next week?" I doubt either of us will be here next week, I thought, as I left the apartment. If David was really alive and waiting for me at the warehouse, tonight would end with either his rescue or both our deaths. There was no middle ground anymore. The game was now in motion, and every move from here would determine who walked away alive.
Was someone they killed to replace me? I watched them bring it to the crash site from a distance. They needed everyone to believe I was dead so they could continue using Natasha to spy on your investigation. David, we need to get you somewhere safe immediately. The FBI has tactical teams surrounding this area, but if the Kozlovs know about this meeting, they do know. He interrupted grimly. Natasha figured out you were suspicious tonight. After you left the apartment, I watched her make calls. They're coming here, probably within the hour. Then we need to leave now. No, Mom, this is our chance to end this. I have everything we need to destroy their operation. Financial records, communication logs, evidence of murders they've committed over the past 5 years. But they have to be caught in the act of trying to silence us, or their lawyers will find ways to discredit the evidence.
I stared at my son, seeing not the boy I'd raised, but a man who had spent weeks living in constant danger to gather evidence against a ruthless criminal organization. David, you're talking about using ourselves as bait. It's the only way, Mom. Your investigation has been compromised for 3 years because they've had inside information. Tonight, we can flip the script. They think they're coming here to eliminate 2 threats, but instead, they're walking into a federal trap. Before I could respond, we heard the sound of vehicles approaching, multiple engines moving without headlights through the warehouse district. David grabbed my arm, pulling me toward a concealed position behind shipping containers. "They're here," he whispered. "Remember, everything that happens now is being recorded. We need them to incriminate themselves on tape." Through gaps in the containers, we watched as 3 black SUVs pulled up to the warehouse. Armed figures emerged from each vehicle, moving with military precision toward the building. I recognized Natasha immediately, even in tactical gear, directing the teams with hand signals. But what shocked me most was seeing a familiar face among the operatives, Detective Lieutenant Carl Haynes from my own department, a man I'd worked with for over a decade. The leak in our investigation hadn't just been information sharing, it had been active participation by a sworn police officer. "There's Detective Haynes," I whispered to David, pointing toward the treacherous cop. "I know. I have recordings of him coordinating with the Kozlovs. Tonight's operation is his idea. Eliminate us both and make it look like a murder-suicide. He's been planning to kill you for months, Mom." The betrayal cut deep, but there was no time to process it. The tactical teams were spreading out around the warehouse, and we were outnumbered at least 12-1. Our only advantage was that they thought David was unarmed and that I was an unsuspecting mother walking into a trap. What they didn't know was that FBI sniper teams had them in their crosshairs and that every word they spoke was being recorded for federal prosecution. Natasha's voice carried clearly in the night air as she coordinated the operation. Remember, we needed to look like the mother killed the son, then herself. "Carl, you'll plant the evidence after we're done." The story is she discovered he was still alive, couldn't handle the psychological break, and snapped. "What about the federal surveillance?" asked Detective Haynes. "We know they've been monitoring Kozlov communications." "Handled," Natasha replied coldly. "After tonight, Rachel Winters won't be able to testify about anything, and all her evidence will be discredited as the delusions of an unstable cop who murdered her own son." That was all the confession we needed. I activated my emergency signal, sending the code that would bring FBI tactical teams down on the warehouse district like an avalanche. But in the moments before backup arrived, David and I were on our own against a dozen armed killers who had already murdered innocent people to protect their operation. The next few minutes would determine whether my son and I survived to see justice served, or whether the Kozlov organization claimed 2 more victims to add to their growing body count. The final confrontation was about to begin, and everything we'd worked for hung in the balance. The signal went out at 11:47 p.m., and within 30 seconds, the warehouse district erupted into controlled chaos as FBI tactical teams moved in from all directions. Spotlights blazed to life, illuminating the area like daylight, while amplified voices commanded the Kozlov operatives to drop their weapons and surrender. From our position behind the shipping containers, David and I watched as the trap we'd helped set snapped shut around Natasha and her team. The precision was breathtaking. Federal agents emerging from positions they'd held for hours, coordinated movements that cut off every escape route, and the overwhelming show of force that left no doubt about the outcome. FBI, drop your weapons. Get on the ground now. Most of the Kozlov operatives complied immediately, recognizing the futility of resistance against superior numbers and positioning. But Natasha and Detective Haynes were different. They were cornered animals with everything to lose, and that made them exponentially more dangerous. "This is Winters," I called out to Agent Park's team, identifying our position. "We're behind the blue containers on the north side." "Acknowledged. Stay down until we give the all clear." But even as federal agents secured the perimeter, I could see Natasha scanning the container yard, her tactical training evident in how she assessed angles and cover points. She was looking for us, and I realized with growing alarm that surrendering wasn't part of her plan.
"She's not going to give up," David whispered, apparently reaching the same conclusion. "She knows if she's taken alive, she'll spend the rest of her life in federal prison. Dead witnesses can't testify." He was right.
Through the gaps in our cover, we watched Natasha signal to Detective Haynes and two other operatives who hadn't yet surrendered. They were forming a breakout plan, using the chaos and darkness to their advantage. "Rachel Winters!" Natasha's voice cut through the night, amplified by training that projected her words across the warehouse yard. "I know you are out here. Let's end this properly. Just you and me." Agent Park's voice crackled through my earpiece. "Do not engage. We have teams moving to your position." But Natasha was already moving, using smoke grenades to create concealment as she advanced toward our position. The federal agents couldn't risk shooting into the smoke cloud without potentially hitting David or me, which gave her exactly the tactical advantage she needed. "Mom, we need to move," David urged, pulling at my arm. "She's coming for us." We began moving deeper into the container maze, but David's injuries from the car crash weeks ago slowed our progress. He was limping badly, and I could hear his labored breathing as we navigated between towering stacks of shipping containers. Behind us, I could hear Natasha's team moving with professional efficiency, using hand signals and coordinated movements to track our path through the container yard. They were trained killers with military precision, while David and I were exhausted from weeks of stress and fear. "This way," David whispered, leading me toward a gap between containers that opened onto the loading dock area. "There's better cover near the warehouse wall." But as we emerged from the container maze, we found ourselves face to face with Detective Haynes, his service weapon trained on my chest. In the harsh glare of the FBI spotlights, I could see the desperation in his eyes, a corrupt cop who knew his career and freedom were already lost. "Hello, Rachel," he said with bitter familiarity. 15 years we worked together. 15 years I watched you get promotions, accolades, respect, while I did the real work of keeping the city's economy functioning. By helping murderers launder money? By betraying every oath you swore as a police officer? By being realistic about how the world actually works. His voice rose with anger and justification. The Kozlovs brought millions in investment to Riverside. Construction jobs, real estate development, legitimate businesses that employed hundreds of people. Your investigation would have destroyed all of that. Along with the murders, the corruption, the drug trafficking. Acceptable costs for economic development, he interrupted, but you couldn't see the bigger picture. You never could. David stepped slightly forward, his movement deliberate and calculated. "Detective Haynes, you were at my house last Christmas. You ate dinner with our family. How could you plan to kill my mother?" "Because she wouldn't listen to reason," Haynes replied, his weapon never wavering. 3 years I tried to steer her away from the Kozlov investigation. 3 years I fed her false leads, misdirected evidence, protected sources. But she kept digging, getting closer to exposing everything. "So you decided murder was easier than retirement," I observed, slowly shifting my weight to improve my position for a potential move. "I decided sacrifice was necessary for the greater good. Rachel's death would have ended the investigation permanently, and Riverside would have continued to prosper under Kozlov investment." That's when Natasha emerged from the shadows behind us, her weapon trained on David. In the glare of spotlights and tactical flashlights, I could finally see her clearly without the mask of grief and innocence she'd worn for months. Her face was cold, professional, utterly devoid of the warmth she'd shown as David's wife. "Touching reunion," she commented with Russian-accented English that she'd perfectly concealed throughout her marriage. "But this conversation ends now." "Natasha Volkov," I said, using her real name deliberately. 3 years infiltrating American law enforcement. Quite an operation." "Longer than 3 years," she corrected with professional pride. "I've been developing this identity since I was 17. Marriage to David was simply the final phase of a very patient strategy." "Did you ever feel anything for him?" David asked, pain evident in his voice despite everything he'd learned about her deception. She considered the question with surprising seriousness. "David was, convenient, intelligent enough to be useful, naive enough to be manipulated, and positioned perfectly to provide access to his mother's investigations. But feelings?" She shrugged. "Feelings are liabilities in my profession." "Your profession being murder," I stated flatly. "My profession being results. The Kozlov organization has invested substantial resources in Riverside's development. Your investigation threatened billions in legitimate business interests.
Eliminating two obstacles was a practical solution. Around us, I could hear FBI teams moving closer, but they were being cautious about potential crossfire in the confined space between containers and warehouse walls. We were on our own for at least another few minutes. "There's something you should know," David said suddenly, his voice carrying a confidence that surprised me. "About the evidence I gathered while I was hiding." Both Natasha and Detective Haynes focused their attention on him, which was exactly what he'd intended. In that moment of distraction, I drew my weapon and dove toward cover behind a concrete barrier, simultaneously calling out positions to the FBI teams.
2 suspects behind the loading dock. Haynes is northwest, Natasha is southeast. The firefight that followed lasted less than 90 seconds, but it felt like hours. Professional training took over as I provided covering fire for David, while FBI tactical teams moved to flank our attackers. The warehouse district echoed with gunfire, shouted commands, and the controlled chaos of a federal operation reaching its climax. When the shooting stopped, Detective Haynes was dead, killed while attempting to fire on FBI agents. Natasha had been wounded in the shoulder and taken into custody, her professional composure finally cracking as she realized her mission had failed completely. "Are you hurt?" I asked David as federal medics rushed to check us both. "I'm fine, Mom. Better than fine. I'm alive, and it's over." Agent Park approached as the scene was being secured, her expression mixing relief with professional satisfaction. "We got them all. 12 arrests, massive evidence seizure, and enough recorded confessions to dismantle the entire East Coast operation." Over the following weeks, the full scope of the Kozlov conspiracy emerged through federal investigation. The organization had been operating in 17 cities, using corrupt law enforcement officials and strategically placed operatives to protect money laundering operations worth over $200 million annually. David's evidence proved crucial in prosecuting not just Natasha and the Riverside cell, but connecting them to murders and financial crimes across multiple states. His weeks in hiding had produced a comprehensive case that federal prosecutors called the most complete organized crime documentation in Bureau of history. The body I'd identified as David turned out to be Thomas Brenner, a homeless veteran who'd been murdered specifically because his physical characteristics could be surgically modified to match David's appearance. The Kozlovs had killed an innocent man simply to create a convincing corpse, adding another murder charge to their growing list of federal crimes. Dr. Patricia Henley's re-examination of the autopsy evidence led to a complete overhaul of identification procedures at the medical examiner's office. The level of deception involved in David's staged death had exposed vulnerabilities in systems that were supposed to be foolproof. Natasha Volkov was sentenced to life in prison without parole for multiple murders, including Thomas Brenner's death and the killing of 3 witnesses who'd threatened to expose Kozlov operations. During her sentencing hearing, she showed no remorse, maintaining that she'd been following orders from her handlers in Moscow. Detective Haynes became a cautionary tale within law enforcement circles, a 15-year veteran who'd compromised his integrity gradually, small corruptions leading to larger betrayals, until he was planning to murder a colleague to protect criminal interests. For David and me, the aftermath was about rebuilding not just our lives, but our relationship. The trauma of believing he was dead, followed by the revelation of how thoroughly our family had been infiltrated, required months of therapy and careful healing. I keep thinking about the funeral, how I stood there grieving while you were hiding, afraid for your life. I hated putting you through that, but it was the only way to gather enough evidence to stop them permanently. If I had come to you immediately, they would have killed us both and found another way to infiltrate your investigation. Dr. Thornton nodded approvingly. You both made impossible choices under extreme circumstances. The important thing is that you survived and justice was served. David eventually returned to his work at TechFlow Solutions, but with a new appreciation for the fragility of safety and trust. I remained as detective commander, but with enhanced security protocols and a deeper understanding of how sophisticated criminal organizations could infiltrate law enforcement. The empty chair at our Sunday breakfasts at Henderson's Diner was filled again, but our conversations now carried the weight of shared trauma and hard-won wisdom. We'd both learned that evil could wear familiar faces, that corruption could hide behind legitimate institutions, and that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to risk losing it completely.
6 months after that night at the warehouse, I received a letter from the FBI director commending our exceptional courage and dedication to justice in the face of mortal danger. It was a nice recognition, but the real victory was simpler and more profound. My son was alive. Our family had survived. And somewhere in federal prison, the people who'd tried to destroy us were spending the rest of their lives paying for their crimes. Sometimes justice takes longer than we'd like, but when it finally arrives, it's worth every moment of patient investigation and careful planning. The Kozlov organization learned too late that underestimating a determined mother, especially one with a badge and the resources of the federal government behind her, was a fatal mistake. David was right about one thing: trust should never be given blindly, but earned through honesty, protected through vigilance, and cherished as the precious gift it truly is. 2 more compelling stories are just a click away. If this one drew you in, wait until you see what else we found. Ready to explore?